everyone! I recently got a tube of burnt sienna gouache from Mgram, and I started to wonder, how different is it really from Mgram's burnt sienna watercolor paint? So, I put them both through some tests, and I'm excited to share what I found while comparing these two paints. My goals were to take a look at their texture, at how water-soluble they are, especially after drying, how they perform while being used, and how opaque each one is. But before we get into their differences, let's go over how they're alike. Both tubes are from the same manufacturer, and from the info I could find, have the same ingredients of honey, gum arabic, and the pigment PBR7. They're both water-soluble, and when squeezed from the tube look nearly identical. Can they really be that different? For the first comparison, I placed some of the burnt sienna watercolor and gouache onto separate white plates. I used a small wooden stick and then a damp brush to stir the paint around. The gouache is smooth and fairly thick. I noticed that it's prone to sticking to the middle of the brush in a clump, which was hard to mix back into the rest of the paint. The watercolor is thick as well and wets easily. Once wet, the puddle of paint kinda stuck together, flowing back towards itself. After letting these untouched daubs of paint dry overnight, I used the sticks again to see if and how the texture changed. As you can see, the gouache dried rock hard. I could not get it to move at all. The watercolor dried some, but it stayed soft and sticky. I wonder if it might have more honey in it than the gouache, but I don't know for sure. To test how easily it is to re-wet the dried paint, I placed about the same amount of water on each daub, then used a damp brush to mix it until it all dissolved. The clips are sped up, but it took 45 seconds to completely dissolve the watercolor, and about 2 minutes and 5 seconds to dissolve the gouache. Alright, now let's see how the paints did on different types of cold press paper. On Saunders Waterford 300-pound paper, I used fresh paint to lay down some swatches, starting with only a small amount of water and increasing the amount for each swatch after. It was difficult to lay down the gouache on the first swatch, but it got easier by the second, and it had enough water added by the third one for it to be laid down smoothly. The watercolor was easy to lay down, and it spread smoothly and evenly from the first swatch. I noticed once I finished the page that there was still a lot of watercolor paint left on the palette, while the gouache was used up more quickly. For the second test, I focused on painting thin washes using the re-wet paint on Archer's 90-pound paper. Both paints laid down their washes nicely, and they looked nearly identical after drying. In the final test, I wanted to compare the opacity of each paint. I started by drawing several thin lines and one thick line with waterproof ink on Strathmore 500 series watercolor paper. I then laid down 4 separate brush strokes perpendicular to the ink lines. Next, I added more layers, letting the paint dry in between and building up to 3 total layers on the lowest stroke. This is where the difference between the watercolor and gouache really shows. Burnt sienna isn't a transparent pigment to begin with, but it's still semi-transparent. It only slightly obscured the ink lines as the layers built up. The gouache really starts to show its opacity by the third stroke, and it completely covers up the ink on the lowest line. Both of them dried to a matte finish. Overall, I found both of these paints to be really nice to work with. Burnt sienna is one of the key pigments in my palette, and I know I'll most likely be using them both for a long time. I hope the info in this video helps give you a better idea of what these two paints are like, and decide if maybe they're art supplies you'd like to try. Thanks for watching!